In late December of last year, my friends and I decided we needed a change of scenery for Christmas. There was 5 of us: Tom, Sarah, Emma, Claire, and me, John. Instead of staying in London, we booked a week-long trip to a small Irish village. We pictured cozy evenings by the fire, festive lights, and maybe a bit of countryside exploration. It seemed like the perfect way to celebrate the holidays. We arrived a few days before Christmas and rented a charming old cottage at the edge of the village. The place was modest, but had that rustic appeal: a warm fireplace, creaky floorboards, and narrow windows that let in just enough winter sun. The locals were friendly, and the streets were decorated with Christmas wreaths and strings of lights. It felt as if we had stepped into a postcard. On our second day there, Sarah discovered a local whiskey distillery tour brochure in the cottage. We all thought it would be fun, an authentic Irish experience. So we went, learned about the distilling process, tasted a few samples, and thoroughly enjoyed ourselves. But it was on our way back that we stumbled upon something interesting. We'd opted to walk through the village after the tour, taking in the decorations and the crisp winter air. That's when we noticed a tiny, run-down liquor store wedged between a shuttered bakery and a dilapidated old bookshop. The handwritten sign in the window read, "Graham's Famous Whiskey Collection. Proceeds to Town Center." Curious, we went inside. The shop was cramped and smelled of old wood and alcohol. Bottles lined every shelf, some covered in dust, others with labels so faded you could barely make out the names. A small Christmas tree sat in the corner, its lights flickering weakly. An elderly woman behind the counter. Her face lit up the moment we walked in. She explained that the collection belonged to a man named Graham Whitmore, who had passed away without any family. According to his will, his entire whiskey collection had to be sold, and the money would go toward the town's upkeep. She said she didn't know him well, only that he was known to be a heavy whiskey drinker, but a decent man, or so people claimed. Tom asked how old the bottles were, and the woman showed us a few with intricate labels. Claire was immediately drawn to one that looked particularly ancient. It was cheap, surprisingly cheap for such rare whiskeys, but she just shrugged and said,
"It's for a good cause."
We agreed to pool some money and buy a handful of bottles as a collective souvenir. As the woman rang us up, she gave a small, almost sad smile. "Remember to raise a glass to Graham when you drink," she said. "He loved his whiskey, or so they say." We nodded politely and stepped out into the chilly evening air, clutching our new treasures. That night, back at the cottage, we lit the fireplace and huddled in the living room to chat and play board games. Emma suggested we open one of the bottles we'd bought. After all, it was Christmas Eve the following day, and we wanted to toast the holiday spirit. Tom, who fancies himself a bit of a whiskey connoisseur, poured each of us a small measure. The liquid was amber gold, and the scent was strong, earthy, smoky, almost mesmerizing. We raised our glasses. Someone, I think it was Sarah, joked, "Don't forget to toast Graham." So we did.
To Graham!
We called out, half laughing, half genuinely curious about the man who once owned these bottles. Later that night, I was the last to go to bed. I remember dousing the fire, making sure the doors were locked, the usual routine. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the window panes. It gave me a strange feeling I couldn't shake off, like we weren't really alone. I had the first nightmare a few hours later. In it, I stood in the middle of a desolate graveyard, the ground covered in fresh snow. The headstones were old and broken, barely visible through the fog. It felt like I was waiting for something, or someone. Suddenly, I noticed a single gravestone right in front of me, the name etched into the cold stone. Graham Whitmore. I didn't recognize it at first, not in the dream. But then I realized, this was the man whose whiskey we had been drinking just hours before. The earth beneath the grave shifted, and a gaunt, pale hand broke through the snow. I heard a voice, low and hollow, calling my name. By the time a figure began to pull itself out of the ground, I woke up, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The clock read 3:15 a.m. The next morning, I tried to laugh it off as a weird nightmare. After all, we'd had a big day and a fair bit to drink, but I couldn't ignore the lingering sense of unease. And I wasn't alone. Emma confessed she'd heard strange scratching noises at the bedroom window in the middle of the night. Claire swore she saw something flicker past the window downstairs. Tom told us it was just our imaginations, whipped up by the eerie atmosphere and the old cottage's creaks. For a moment, I believed him, until the dreams continued, every night. On the third night, the dream shifted. Instead of just a grave, I saw images of young women, their faces drawn in terror. They were hidden away in a dark cellar, chained, pleading for help. And standing in the doorway was a tall figure, his back turned, but I knew it was Graham. I heard him whisper, "They said I was a good man." But they were wrong. We cut our holiday short and left for London the next day. Christmas or not, we couldn't stay there another night. Once home, I hoped everything would go back to normal. But it didn't. I kept seeing that graveyard when I slept. The same name carved into stone, Graham Whitmore, and every time he came closer. One evening, I was sitting in my living room alone. I caught my reflection in the mirror above the fireplace, and for a split second, it wasn't me. It was someone else, with sunken eyes and a twisted grin. I yelped and nearly fell out of my chair. When I looked again, my reflection was back to normal, but my hands were still shaking. A week after we returned, I got a frantic call from Sarah. She'd been reviewing some photos we took in Ireland. Shots of the cottage, the snowy village, the liquor store. In one of them, taken right outside the store, there was a smudge in the background, a tall shape standing just behind the window. It looked like a man wearing a dark coat, only his face was blank, no features at all. That was when I realized we might never truly shake Graham's presence. He wasn't just a memory, he was something that wanted to cling to us, or maybe just me, long after we left Ireland. I finally did some digging. I called the village's small tourist center and asked about Graham Whitmore. The woman on the other end hesitated before admitting that rumors had circulated for years. He'd been suspected of crimes, kidnappings, and worse, though nothing was ever proven. Locals still whispered that he was responsible for the disappearance of several young girls in the 1970s. They said no one dared confront him because he was so quiet and unassuming. When he died, people found his stash of rare whiskeys, and little else. The stories varied, but none ended well for those who got too close to Graham. That phone call chilled me to my core. Suddenly, it all made sense. The dreams, the horrible visions, the figure in the window. If Graham had been a monster in life, maybe he wasn't finished even in death. I don't drink whiskey anymore, and I certainly don't keep old bottles lying around. In fact, I gave away the last of Graham's bottles to a collector who didn't ask too many questions. Part of me feels guilty for unloading them on someone else, but I couldn't bear to keep them. So if you ever find yourself in a quaint village liquor store, eyeing a dusty old collection of whiskey with a backstory that seems just a little too strange, think twice before you buy it. And if you must drink it, don't toast to the man who owned it, because some spirits refuse to stay buried.